I want to make the human being more efficient with their breathing, that they can do a lot more with less. It has been absolutely overlooked. No child who is mouth breathing and no adult who is mouth breathing is reaching their full potential. And many people will say, yes, they have their mouths closed during the day. Do you have your mouth closed during sleep? Do you have your mouth closed during physical exercise? And when I look at individuals coming in with anxiety, panic disorder, high stress levels, I'm seeing fast upper chest breathing. How can you address agitation of the mind unless you address breathing?
2 new studies just out tying sleep apnea, a common disorder that causes snoring and dangerous pauses in breathing at night, to cancer.
From a child into my teenage years, I had chronic nasal obstruction, I was a chronic mouth breather, and I had chronic asthma. I was mouth breathing, and then my sleep was impacted. I'm constantly in fight or flight response.
Other symptoms of sleep apnea in children include hyperactivity, trouble focusing in school, depression or anger, and even bedwetting.
Now, you send a child into school with that breathing pattern. I was losing interest in school. In 1988, I left school altogether. It was my breathing that was holding me back. It wasn't my intelligence. We need a drastic change in the healthcare model. Maybe it's when their pockets are hurt, but this is where we need the awareness in the general public. I've worked directly with about 5, 6, 7,000 people. I've seen Olympic athletes, their sleep improved. One of our instructors is training Navy SEALs. You know, there's a reason that these guys now are bringing it in, because it's not just about sleep, it's not just about a stuffy nose, it's about so much more else.
The world is changing. Inspiration is everywhere. It has never been so easy to connect, share, and bring people together. We're learning from others and finding the best in ourselves. Challenging our beliefs, sharing our vulnerability, overcoming our fears, transforming ourselves so we can transform the world. How far can we go?
This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is... With almost 50 years on this planet, I pretty much figured that I knew how to breathe. But how much was I wrong? And I sat down with Patrick McKeown of the Oxygen Advantage, and he explained to me how most of us are breathing through our mouths, from our kids to our athletes to even you, and how it's completely messing up our physiology, our health, our performance, everything. And Patrick is very serious about his work. He's been working with children and athletes and high performers for many, many years, and showing them the tremendous benefits of nasal breathing. And after having this episode with Patrick, I actually went home and taped my mouth shut to see if that would help me breathe during the night. You can see a picture of it from Instagram. It looks pretty freaky. Also, Patrick had me running around the studio with an oxygen meter on my finger, and he also dispelled a lot of myths about certain breathing techniques and how they don't hyper-oxygenate the body, but they actually lower your carbon dioxide. This is really important stuff. I think Patrick is at the forefront of his field. He works with people like Laird Hamilton and people at the high level of their game, and I know you're gonna find this incredibly helpful. Definitely pay attention. This could affect you, your health, your kids, and everything. So sit back and enjoy my conversation with Patrick. This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is Patrick McKeown, the world-renowned breathing expert, author, and lecturer. Over the past 15 years, you've trained thousands of people around the world with breathing techniques that lower stress levels, reduce overall anxiety, and improve physical well-being. You're a student of the Bew-tech-oh breathing method from Moscow, and your latest book, The Oxygen Advantage, aims to revolutionize your health and fitness using simple, scientifically proven breathing techniques. Patrick, welcome to London Real.
Thanks very much, Brian.
Great having you here. You know, I was having dinner with Dr. Daniel Stickler and his amazing wife, Micra, a couple months ago after Daniel was on the show. And Micra couldn't stop talking about you and your breathing techniques. She's a trained athlete, special forces, all sorts of stuff. And I think she'd spent a few days with you, and she said, you got to get Patrick on the show. I had been hearing about you over the last couple of years and the Oxygen Advantage. So I really wanted to have you here today to go deep on all these things that we don't understand about breathing.
Sure.
So it's great to have you here. To be honest, 5 years ago, somebody said on one of my shows that I was talking about like plant medicines and ayahuascas, and they said, you know, breathing can get you to those states. And I was like, you know, you're crazy. And honestly, I never thought breathing could ever do anything. And then you saw people like Wim Hof come onto the scene and all these different breathing techniques. And I think, Patrick, people are starting to take breathing seriously.
I think so.
But I know most of your life, you were banging on the door saying, everybody wake up.
Yes.
This is really serious stuff. It can affect your child development, your sleep, your health, your everything. But you spent a lot of your career trying to get people to wake up, right?
Just to a large degree, you know. I had a motive here because from a child into my teenage years, into my mid-20s, I had chronic nasal obstruction, I was a chronic mouth breather, and I had chronic asthma. And if you have inflammation of the lungs, it's not just isolated to the lungs. Because now, since 2007, researchers have identified it as one airway. So your nose, your throat, your lungs are all linked. And if there's a problem with one, it can travel up to the other and vice versa. And the thing about the nose is, if you have nasal obstruction, if you have a stuffy nose, you're twice as likely to have a sleep problem. So here as a kid, I was having asthma, I was caught for breath. Because I was having asthma, I had also nasal obstruction because it's very common that the two go hand in hand. And because of that then, I was mouth breathing, and then my sleep is impacted. And of course, I'm breathing fast upper chest. I'm constantly in fight or flight response. Now, you send a child into school with that breathing pattern. And that child, in primary school, I was bright. I was top of the class. Come secondary school, high school, I dropped from the top of the class right down to the bottom. I was losing interest in school. In 1988, I left school altogether. And people are probably shocked with that. Why is a kid at 14 years of age leaving school? My parents were realists because they were seeing that if a child doesn't want to continue, and also the measurement of intelligence and success is not necessarily based on academic ability. Many people have high academic qualifications, high academic intelligence, and they have achieved very little. Creative people, intuition, and there's other aspects of intelligence that is not taught through the educational system. I had a bit of drive with me, but I had poor health. So make a long story short, actually we went back to school a year later, and I drove myself through school, got into university, got into Trinity College in Dublin, which is a pretty decent college to get into. I had to spend 10 hours a day studying. That's what I did. So my motive is, it was my breathing that was holding me back. It wasn't my intelligence. It was my chronic mouth breathing. And I was going to doctors every 3 months. I was in hospital a few times. Not one healthcare professional during that time says, Patrick, breathe through your nose. In early 2000s, probably 1998, 1999, I came across a newspaper article. And the newspaper article spoke about a Russian doctor, and he said two things. He says, breathe through your nose and you breathe light. And as a chronic mouth breather, I was doing none of those things. I was breathing through my mouth. I was often caught for breath, and I had fast, noticeable breathing. Not that you're having an asthma attack all the time or a panic attack, but that your breathing is in excess of what it should be. And this is the crux of it. When I switched to nasal breathing, my sleep within 2 to 3 days, I woke up more alert than I had in the previous 10 to 15 years. That's not an exaggeration.
10 to 15 years?
Yes, yes.
Just from better sleep?
Just from better sleep. And this, you know, even though I found it purely by accident, I actually taped up the first night, taped my mouths, and because my nose was so stuffy, I was able to unblock it using breath hold techniques, but I also had to get nasal dilators to open up my nose. So you can imagine the first night, I had a nasal dilator on my nose, I had tape on my mouth to force myself to breathe through my nose, and it took me a couple of days just to get the hang of it. Then I started waking up my alert. My wheezing reduced by about 50% in that week. Now, this was driving me. I wanted to get it out there. So I have
no medications. All you did was force yourself to breathe through your nose.
Change my breathing.
Now you
patterns.
just said taped your mouth like it's like it was casual, but most people are going to be freaked out and saying, "What? You tape your mouth closed when you go to sleep?" I've heard a few people mention that before, but that is shocking to a lot of people, right?
It's huge.
Right, and
I
you've
mean
also taped your daughter's mouth shut,
Yes,
and we're going to
I
get
have.
into the kids stuff as well.
Absolutely, yes.
Right?
Yes.
I feel like you walk around the neighborhood sneaking into people's houses and taping their mouths, but it probably would make for a better...
Well, we've created a momentum here.
Okay.
Taping of the mouth now is becoming more mainstream. It's not just in the fringes.
I've heard about it.
If you see now, there's products on the market, and we'll have our own product coming on the market for children, because it's always been the issue. I always wanted to get kids, how do we get children breathing through their noses? If we let a child continue to mouth breathe, it's going to impact the craniofacial development. It's going to result in malocclusion of the teeth, crooked teeth, because the mouth isn't closed and the tongue isn't resting in the roof of the mouth. We need a growing child to have their lips together, to breathe through their nose, both during wakefulness and during sleep, and with correct resting tongue posture of being in the roof of the mouth. It's the tongue in the roof of the mouth that exerts a pressure to drive the jaws forward on the face to make room for the airway. The mouth-breathing child, they don't have the counteracting force of the tongue, and as a result, their jaws are developed set back, and as a result, their airway is compromised. And their airway isn't compromised just during childhood. Their airway is compromised for the rest of their life. We talk about obstructive sleep apnea, and we talk about an epidemic that's out there now. 43% of males aged between 50 and 70, 27% of females aged between 50 and 70, 26% of males aged between 30 and 49, and 9% of females aged between 30 and 49.
Have apnea of some sort.
Sleep disorder breathing, and at high risk of obstructive sleep apnea. And that's a European, Swiss, relatively recent study.
Wow.
Now, could that be absolutely resolved? Yes, if we looked at breathing during childhood. And this is really where we want to get to the crux of it, because it has been absolutely overlooked. We know studied, statistics looking at children, 25 to 50% of studied children persistently mouth breathe. And if a child is mouth breathing, their sleep is impacted. And if their sleep is impacted, they have 40% chance of developing ADD, ADHD, and or a learning disability.
So you think it's all sleep related?
Sleep and breathing go together.
What
if your
happened-
breathing is off, your sleep is off.
Okay, what happened 100,000 years ago when we're out hunter-gathering throughout the savannas?
Yes.
Did we nose breathe then?
Yes.
And
Yes.
How do we know that, and what would have made us more likely to nose breathe?
We know by the shape of the face.
Okay. And just so people understand, literally the shape of your entire cranium, facial,
Yes.
jaw changes as a child if you don't breathe right.
Absolutely. And 60% of the growth of the face is achieved by 4 years of age. So we have a very brief window of opportunity there. 90% of the growth of the face is achieved by 12 years of age. So if you were to look at a study that came out on Neanderthals about 2 years ago, the researchers identified that they had really wide facial structures. They had very large nostrils, and the researchers put down the large nostrils, not just because they were nasal breathing during rest, but they were nasal breathing during physical exercise. Professor John Mew, he's based here in London. He's also an anthropologist. He was also trained as an orthodontic surgeon. He's an orthodontist, and he's 90 years of age now. And he writes about 400 years ago here in the UK, when they unearthed bodies from graves from upper middle class background, people who had access to sugar. They noticed that the craniofacial development was much poorer. In other words, they had narrow facial structures, jaws that were set back, and they had overcrowding of teeth. If you go into any natural history museum, you don't see overcrowding of teeth. Crooked teeth are a problem. And it's not just an aesthetic problem, but it's an airway problem. Because the vast majority of kids who breathe through their open mouth, they will develop crooked teeth. And the reason that they have crooked teeth is because they don't have the tongue resting in the roof of the mouth. Now, I know traditional orthodontists will probably say that it's down to genetics. It's not down to genetics. This has changed remarkably in the last 50 to 100 years. We don't even have to go back 100,000 years ago. Whether
And it's because of sugar?
I think diet has been one aspect of it.
Because
I think
something triggered
stress,
it, right?
Yes.
Because it's not like the hunter-gatherers knew to walk around and they didn't have any tape.
Yes.
And they probably didn't say, we know nasal breathing is the right way.
Yes.
Although maybe it was a meme, maybe they would watch people and maybe it was something everyone did and they just did it without thinking about it. But
Yes.
what would trigger people?
There's
to
a number
mouth?
of things to
Okay.
it. One is
Okay.
tongue tie. So, for instance, midwives in 16th century France, when the infant was born, they used to open up the baby's mouth and just check the string that holds the tongue to the floor of the mouth. And if it was too tight, they had an extra long fingernail, they just clipped it. And the reason they did that was because they wanted the tongue to move freely in the mouth, because the tongue was necessary for breastfeeding. If their tongue was stuck to the floor of the mouth, that child couldn't breastfeed, the child wouldn't thrive, and back in the 16th century, the child would probably die. So human beings, we've seen interventions like this throughout. And if you look at a book written back in the 1870s called Shut Your Mouth and Save Your Life by an American painter called George Catlin, he went and spent time with the North American Indians because he thought their traditions were dying out. So as an artist, he wanted to chronicle this. He wrote about the Native Americans, where every time that the baby had the lips apart, the mother would go over to the baby and press the lips together. And he also spoke about the European settlers, kids coming over, adults coming over, sleeping on their backs, mouth open, just breathing hard. So, it's always being there. And I think food, especially we're eating very soft food now, which is not developing the muscles of the face, lack of breastfeeding. And I know, listen, I'm not blaming mothers here. Society has forced mothers to work because we're all up to our debt, all up to our neck in mortgages. So I really understand that the significance that the mom is often pressurized to go back into work to make sure that the family home is paid for. But breastfeeding is really important, not just for nutrition, because it's breastfeeding that develops the muscles. It develops the muscles of the face, so the baby has good muscle tone. And with this, then that the baby is more likely to restore nasal breathing. So there's probably not just one factor, and you can't isolate which factors cause mouth breathing and which don't, but it can be addressed, and that's the key.
All right, so this is, you just shot a big old cannonball across the bow of the world and said, wait a second, a lot of our problems could be because our children and we are breathing through our mouths and not our noses. And that can affect, like you said, when you talk about your case, it's a great point. So again, you've got all of this, inflammation happening in your lungs, going to your nose, then you're lacking of sleep, you have anxiety, you send that kid into school, and now you've got a dysfunctional student.
Yes.
And now that can ruin lives.
Totally.
And this can also self-fulfill and continue.
Yes.
So, okay, a little bit back to your story. How did you figure all this stuff out? So just maybe finishing on your story. You read the article about the Russian that said, close your mouth, breathe through your nose.
Yes.
Tell us a bit more.
And I had finished my master's and I was in the corporate world at the time. So my job as a kind of mid-20s was looking after staff. I was in middle management and I always felt highly stressed. And I felt I didn't like when I was working, it was an American multinational called Enterprise Rent-A-Car. I didn't like the degree of control that was put on us as employees, that every move was kind of restricted. That's how I felt. I didn't like the pressure that was put on me, and for me then to put that pressure then on the people underneath me. And I felt it was just absolutely being milked. So I hated it. And I absolutely hated going into work of a Monday morning. And this was a good thing, because I took such a risk leaving that job, leaving the company car, leaving a good wage, and start breathing. And I went into the father-in-law and I told him I'm leaving. I wasn't married at the time. And he says, what are you going to do? And I says, I'm going to teach breathing exercise. And I could see him going like that, kind of. So I knew then, it took a risk, and maybe the naivety, because I was only a kid in my mid-20s, that naivety, and also because I hated my previous job so much, it gave me the momentum and the drive to get out of there and to start. So I contacted the Russian embassy because I didn't know anybody in Russia, and I couldn't find a Russian speaker in Ireland. There was no immigration in Ireland, very little, back in the late 1990s.
Right.
So I contacted the Russian embassy and I asked, could they track down the people in Moscow? So I made contact with them. I ended up flying over. I trained with them in Moscow, and I was accredited by the professor, Konstantin Bew-tech-oh. And then I came back to Ireland and I started working primarily with people with asthma. So we put it out, the local newspaper wrote a story. I had my first 3 clients. This was in 2002. Okay. So I put my university degree absolutely to one side. And I started working with kids with asthma and adults with asthma, teaching them, the breathing exercises. And media really got behind it. I was so lucky. The Irish Independent wrote articles. I was on television. And it's just kind of bizarre. I had so many lucky breaks in that I was able to fulfill a passion, because I was also seeing the results. And this was the key, because too often, like most people, and I know I'm probably going off topic a bit, but I found a job that was really suited to me, and very few people find a job that's suited to them. If you can find something that's suited to you, it's effortless and it's wonderful work. And also it's so fulfilling because we were seeing kids, we were seeing adults, we were seeing them reaching their full potential. And I'll come back to it. Mouth breathing. No child who is mouth breathing and no adult who is mouth breathing is reaching their full potential. And many people will say, yes, they have their mouths closed during the day. Do you have your mouth closed during sleep? Do you have your mouth closed during physical exercise? And where is the correct tongue resting posture? Because your tongue has got two places to be. It's either in the roof of the mouth or it's falling back into the throat. If your tongue is falling back into the throat, the airway is compromised. If the airway is compromised, your sleep is compromised. And if your sleep is compromised, your day is compromised.
Yeah, no, that's true. And again, I'm wearing this Oura ring because I'm trying to track my sleep better. And I was just telling you, yesterday, I had a difficult day. It was a hard day because I had lousy sleep the night before. I woke up at 4 a.m. I couldn't get back to sleep. And I was telling you, I stopped drinking 2 years ago, but I felt like I was hungover the next day. I just felt compromised, cranky. Training was hard. And I was just like, wow. So I know how high quality sleep is important.
Yes.
We've been hearing about sleep apnea the last few years. I mean, 20 years ago, I don't know if anyone
wasn't on
heard
the radar.
But we know people are out there that are sometimes dangerously risking their life because they literally stop breathing in the middle of the night because of blockages. Sometimes it's because you're overweight, not always.
Yes.
So, but what you're saying is even the mouth breathing at night can be affecting everybody right now.
Mouth breathing is contributing to obstructive sleep apnea in a big way. Now, of course, doctors will say it's oversimplified. Let's look at how sleep medicine has changed since 2015. In 2002, we were talking about nose breathing and we were using breath hold time as a measurement of breathing pattern disorders. 2018, Messino, who was a Harvard medical doctor, in looking at one of the phenotypes of obstructive sleep apnea called loop gain, he said, how do you measure loop gain? You use breath hold time.
Breath hold time.
Breath hold time. And an individual who has a low breath hold time during rest will have high loop gain during sleep. And what that means is that they have very unstable breathing during sleep. But I'll just give you a very simplified definition of obstructive sleep apnea.
Okay, and then we have to talk about breath hold time.
Sure.
Okay.
Obstructive sleep apnea is when the upper airway collapses during sleep. And it's a battle that's going on between your negative pressure created inspiration. So as you're drawing air into the lungs, it's causing a negative pressure in the throat, and this is causing the throat to come inwards. And the airway can collapse at 4 different places. One is the soft palate, one is the tongue falling back into the throat, one is the epiglottis, or one is the throat itself. We really need to get these airway dilator muscles working. And we do this by changing breathing patterns because, as I said at the start, it's not an isolated airway. The airway muscles here are linked with the diaphragm, and your diaphragm is linked with your nose. You can't get these airway dilator muscles working effectively because during wakefulness, the airway dilator muscles, there's 20 muscles in the throat, and it's a subset of those that help to maintain an open airway. During wakefulness, our airway is kept open, but during sleep, the muscles get lazy and the airway collapses. Now, individuals can they can not hold their breath, they can stop breathing for about 90 seconds to 2 minutes, not even waking up out of it. They resume breathing with huge gasps of breath. During the stopping of the breath, their blood pressure is going up through the roof. They're putting a lot of stress in their heart. Their blood oxygen saturation could go down to 60%. Now, you need to get up to Mount Everest to achieve that. And these individuals wake up in the morning and they can be doing that 20, 30, 40, 50 times an hour, every night, every week, every month, and it will absolutely certainly reduce life expectancy.
It's amazing to me that you don't wake up, that you stop breathing for like you said, 90 seconds or 2 minutes and you're still in a sleeping state.
Yes.
I mean,
you will have sleep fragmentation. So you're constantly being awoken from the depth of sleep up to more shallow sleep. And with one phenotype of sleep apnea called arousal threshold, those individuals are light sleeping all the time. So they're going to wake up exhausted anyway, even if they don't have huge events. And this is where sleep medicine has changed, and we need really to get the research looking at breathing and sleep. But all too often, the medical profession, they don't want to know about breathing, and I think it's partly because of egos. And I'm going to put it out there, because medical is all about the science and the latest technology and discovering, these new DNA and all of this stuff. And what's breathing like? Well, I will say that breathing is going to be the solution, or part of the solution to sleep. It could be an oversimplification, but I've been joining the dots together. And what's more, since 2002, I've worked directly with about 5,000, 6,000, 7,000 people. You know, this isn't just kind of stuff that's coming out of my head. I'm working with kids, I'm working with adults all the time. I've seen Olympic athletes, their sleep improved. You know, you mentioned special forces. We have some of our instructors who use this stuff with training with the SWAT, Special Weapon and Tactics. One of our instructors is training Navy SEALs. You know, there's a reason that these guys now are bringing it in, because it's not just about sleep, it's also about focus and about performance. And coming back to breath whole time, it ties in with both breathing, sleep, and stress.
Okay. And real quickly, we had Matthew Walker in here who talks a lot about sleep, and he really said the same thing. Look, the lack of sleep, it's not only making you tired and making you cranky, it literally is shortening your life. And I think most people don't think that.
Yes.
We always had this, I sleep when I'm dead, you know, high performance people don't sleep, but that's all nonsense.
Yes, it's
all
absolutely nonsense.
the high performance people I know sleep a lot.
Yes, and to sleep, not just quantity, quality.
Yeah.
And here's the difference, because people over 40 years of age, we're 6 times more likely to sleep with an open mouth. We're 6 times more likely to spend at least 50% of our sleep time breathing both through the nose and through the mouth. And it is really about the quality. And if you look at the books written on sleep, it's all the emphasis on sleep hygiene, don't be using your mobile phone, make sure your room is dark, you know, silent, all of this stuff, don't drink alcohol. Of course, this stuff is all good, but they're missing the elephant in the room. If your mouth is open, your tongue is falling into the airway, the mandible, the lower jaw is falling back into the airway. There's a resistance to your breathing that's 2.5 times more breathing through your mouth during sleep. That resistance is creating turbulence to airflow. And also, we need nasal breathing to harness nitric oxide as a signaling molecule to the upper airway dilator muscles. We need carbon dioxide, because carbon dioxide is not just the drive to breathe. Even though people think we breathe to bring in oxygen, we don't. We actually breathe to get rid of excess CO2. But if we're breathing hard, and if we're getting rid of too much carbon dioxide from the blood through the lungs, the brain doesn't send a signal to these upper airway dilator muscles. We need nasal breathing for diaphragmatic breathing for increased lung volume, and increased lung volume for stiffening of the pharyngeal airway. There's too many dots there. We have to, and that's what I would love is if we had some research. Let's get individual nasal breathing. Let's get their tongue resting in the roof of the mouth. Let's get diaphragmatic breathing, slow breathing with a good breath hold time. And I will leave with this. Dr. Christian Guilleminault was a Stanford medical doctor. In the 1970s, he coined the phrase obstructive sleep apnea. He also developed the apnea-hypopnea index, which is a measurement of the severity of sleep disorder breathing. Since 2015, he's been talking about the critical importance of restoring nasal breathing. And one of his quotes is, "The only valid and complete correction of pediatric sleep disorder breathing is restoration of continuous nasal breathing, both during wakefulness and during sleep." And what's more, thousands of kids are getting their adenoids removed, they're getting their tonsils removed because to help open up the airway. There's a 67% chance of relapse in 2 years unless nasal breathing is restored. Now, 6 years ago, I put my daughter through adenoidectomy and tonsillectomy. If I was to do it again, I wouldn't have done it. I now know, because you learn from your mistakes, but there was no mention of nasal breathing post-surgery. I had an operation on my nose in 1994, and the good surgeon who fixed my nose, he never told me to breathe through it. This is really a wake-up call. We need to start, looking at kids who are going through a traumatic procedure with generalized anesthetic. They're coming back out in the trolley. They've had their, really traumatic, not just for the kids, but as a parent, I can talk about just firsthand from that. Why are we allowing these kids to persist with mouth breathing that it's only going to be short term?
Do you think in 50 years we'll look back on this as just like idiocy, like we used to smoke cigarettes and doctors, we used to recommend it, that we weren't actually nasal breathing?
The drivers here are going to be the general public, and it's the general public which is driving this. And I think what's going to happen is that the general public will drive it. It takes 20 years for something to happen in the field of medicine. And, I'd written a few books primarily on health, and the emphasis was health, asthma, anxiety, sleep, craniofacial development in children. And I was just thinking, why aren't, okay, dentists have been brilliant. There's a cohort of dentists and different, like a lot of 50% of my time is kind of giving talks, sleep disorder breathing to the dental profession. But the medical profession have really lagged. And it does take about 20 years there. So I'm hoping that the general public, that they start noticing the difference. And it's common sense. And I've had a debate in sleep congresses with a professor of medicine in Chicago about 2 years ago. And he's saying it doesn't matter how people breathe. And I said, listen, have you ever read a medical textbook? Have you ever seen the functions of the nose? Do you actually know what the nose is doing on the face? How can you say that the nose, it doesn't matter how you breathe? Because this is not new stuff, Brian. 1988, Swift, a researcher, in one of the papers, which is written by an ENT from New Zealand called Dr. James Bartley, when people were forced, post-jaw surgery, their jaws are wired shut, so they were forced to breathe through their nose. When they were forced to breathe through their nose, the pressure of oxygen in the blood increased by 10%. Like, I can break down from just, the benefits of nasal breathing. And none of this is new. Dr. Morris Cotley founded the Rhinological Society in the 1970s. He said the human nose performs 30 functions in the human body. We are the only species on Earth, with the exception of a dog, who persistently mouth breathes. And a dog mouth breathes to regulate body temperature. The racehorse, the cheetah, the elephant, any animal that's healthy, nasal breathe. Animals and human beings are the exception.
That's powerful stuff. I mean, I don't know why we would expect doctors to be up on this stuff. I mean, they're not up on sleep. They're rarely up on nutrition. They're rarely up on any of this stuff because they're not taught that. I mean, I think in the entire medical school, they're not even, but one day they're taught about sleep. And so usually it's other people on the cutting edge of these fields that are opening their eyes to these things. Because also doctors, a lot of times motivated by drugs, drug prescriptions, high margin procedures, all of that stuff. And the last thing they want to do is tell their patients, get more sleep, breathe through your nose, goodbye. They're probably going to lose all their patients.
Yes. Well, we need a drastic change in the healthcare model. And maybe it's going to take, when profit reduces, that individuals and that the industry will change. Maybe it's when their pockets are hurt. But this is where we need the awareness in the general public. And I feel for kids. I feel for the child, the 4 and 5 and 6 and 7-year-old kid, the child with rhinitis. Allergic rhinitis is so common, 30% of the Western population, 60 million Americans. Like, we have in the UK here one of the highest rates of asthma in the world. You don't just have asthma. You also are more likely to have rhinitis, 60% chance.
What is rhinitis?
Rhinitis is when your nose is stuffy. Okay. So like hay fever.
Yeah.
So hay fever would be allergic rhinitis.
Right.
And if you have nasal stuffiness, you have poor sleep. But your mouth is also driving breathing to the upper chest, and upper chest breathing and fast breathing is fight or flight. So it's not just about asthma. It's not just about a stuffy nose. It's about so much more else.
Now, talk to me, your fellow Irishman, Conor McGregor, had a boxing match with Floyd Mayweather a couple years ago.
Yes.
And you were watching his breathing, right?
I was, yes.
Because you're into sports science. I mean, you spend a lot of time with athletes.
Yes.
What did you see in that fight?
I think he's a terrible breather. And you can see this, and this is how so easy it is to see. Like, go onto any YouTube interview where he's giving an interview to the press. Not after a fight, because of course your breathing is going to be laboured after a fight. I'm looking at his breathing during rest. I'm seeing fast breathing from the chest. There's no natural pauses post-exhalation. And what that is telling me, that his respiratory rate is too much. He's breathing thoracically. His breathing is entirely inefficient. His oxygen uptake is going to be reduced. His oxygen delivery is going to be reduced. He is not breathing optimally. And that's going to have an impact in sports. What are the impact? Disproportionate breathlessness, gassing out too soon, respiratory muscle fatigue, and also inadequate oxygen delivery to the muscles. Now, this is when the legs give out. And if you watch that, if you remember that fight, it's funny enough, the commentator was really on the ball. On the 8th or 9th round, he said he's really starting to mouth breathe hard.
Yeah.
And then it was a round afterwards, his legs started to go jelly. Now, here's the interesting thing. 50% of athletes are prone to respiratory muscle fatigue because the diaphragm trumps everything. The body is there to make sure that respiration is maintained because we can only last without air, for a few brief minutes. Now, if the respiratory muscles are fatiguing, blood is diverted from the legs to feed the diaphragm. And you may see an athlete and they're going hard, and the next thing is their legs are going from under them. Is that due to a buildup of hydrogen ion, which also can be improved by breathing, or is it due to respiratory muscle fatigue? His legs went from under him, game over. And, you know, here again, and I contacted the coach and I said, listen, I says,
Kavanaugh.
yes, I sent an email to John Kavanagh and I said, really, you'd want to look at Conor's breathing here. No reply. And I think it's because it's only in certain cohorts. Now, in saying that, we've some Olympic athletes, we've some really high-level individuals who get this, but it hasn't happened across. I think it's the innovators now.
I'm going to email John after this because there's been a couple London Real guests that have spent some time with Conor, and we'll try to get you in there. Great. You really think it would make a difference on his performance?
I would say without a doubt.
Wow.
There's no way that you have an athlete that's breathing. If you have poor breathing patterns, dysfunctional breathing at rest, it cannot automatically correct itself during physical exercise. It's your everyday breathing that impacts your breathing during sports. And there's so much you can do with the breath. The breath isn't just this thing that's used by hippies with the open sandals and the tree huggers. This is about performance. This is about resilience. This is about getting to the science and looking at the power of the breath. And by the way, I'm not talking about going to some instructor and the instructor's telling you to take this big breath. That's total nonsense. We're talking about the different dimensions of breathing. All too often, there's such an emphasis placed on biomechanics of breathing, breathing using your diaphragm, taking these full breaths of air into your lungs. You know, you cannot sacrifice the biochemistry of the breath and concentrate on the biomechanics. We need to have a balance between all three. Yes, I'm all for biomechanics. The diaphragm is very important. Diaphragm is linked with your emotions. Diaphragm is linked with spinal stabilization, for posture, for movement, but also the biochemistry, which determines the release of oxygen from the red blood cells to the cells. How many times have we heard, take a deep breath, and the person takes this big breath. What's the big breath doing? It's blowing off carbon dioxide, and the loss of CO2 is causing hemoglobin to hold onto oxygen. We don't want our red blood cells holding onto oxygen. We need our red blood cells to release oxygen. How do the red blood cells release oxygen? They release it in the presence of carbon dioxide. As carbon dioxide increases, blood pH drops, and the affinity of hemoglobin for oxygen reduces. This was discovered in 1904. By changing your breathing, you can open up your blood vessels, 70,000 miles of circulation. We can influence that. Just get the individual to really slow down their breath, focus on the airflow coming into the nose, focus on the airflow leaving the nose, and deliberately slow down the breathing to the point of air hunger. Air hunger tells you that carbon dioxide is increasing in the blood. And as carbon dioxide is increasing in the blood vessels dilate. But also as carbon dioxide increases in the blood, hemoglobin releases oxygen. So when we're talking about breathing, it's not about necessarily the individual who's going into this studio and you hear everybody in the room breathe. You shouldn't hear anybody breathe during rest. If they're breathing hard during rest, they're getting rid of carbon dioxide, they're causing their blood vessels to constrict, and they're impeding the release of oxygen from the red blood cells to hemoglobin. This is really where, you know, we need to start breaking down the different dimensions. And I would hope that professionals who are teaching yoga, Pilates, counseling, that they start looking at the different aspects of the breath. Don't just concentrate on one part of the breath and sacrifice the rest.
Yeah, so the big deep breath can actually hurt you, is what you're saying.
It's not increasing oxygen uptake in the blood. It's not increasing oxygen delivery. And if you continue taking that big deep breath, you'll be stuck in that pattern of hyperventilation, chronic hyperventilation. Now, it's often hidden. And you could have an individual who is breathing fairly normal during rest, but they go and do physical exercise and they're having disproportionate breathlessness. You know, we should be able to tolerate, a mark of a good level of fitness is an individual who can go for a run with light breathing. If you think of somebody who is very unwell, they walk and they get out of breath walking up a flight of stairs. So there is a correlation between fitness and ventilation. And people who are in good states of health with good breathing, they have light breathing.
Okay. What do you think of Wim Hof? He's been on the show a few years ago,
Yes.
and he's known for his cold water therapy, which is
Yes.
great stuff, but also his breathing techniques.
Yes.
And that is rapid breathing.
Yes.
I've done it with him, and it's...
Yes.
I'm probably messing up all my hemoglobin right now, right? But what do you think of that?
I think it's very interesting as a stressor. It's primarily as a stressor. That is not going to...
But it also hyperoxygenates your blood as well.
But that's what we're going to talk about.
Okay, all right. Okay. But it stresses you.
If we look at the oxygen in the blood is carried two ways. 98% of your oxygen is carried bound by hemoglobin. Now, at normal breathing, if we were to put a pulse oximeter on, our blood is already fully saturated.
Pulse oximeter, what is that?
It's a little device that you place on your nail, and it picks up the hemoglobin if it's saturated by oxygen. So basically...
It can see through your skin.
Exactly.
And
There's a little red light and an infrared light.
Okay.
I have one in my bag, and of course I forgot that prop, but however.
Okay.
So we know that breathing at rest, that your blood is already almost fully saturated. That carries 98% of your oxygen. 2% of your oxygen is dissolved in the blood. Now, if you hyperventilate, you can increase the amount of oxygen dissolved in the blood, but you cannot increase the saturation of your hemoglobin with oxygen. The hyperventilation, therefore, it's not increasing oxygen uptake in the blood. It's increasing a little that's dissolved, but here's what the hyperventilation is also doing. It's getting rid of too much carbon dioxide. 30 seconds of hard breathing will reduce CO2 in the blood by half. Every 1 millimeter drop of CO2 reduces blood flow to the brain by 2%. Now, if you think of that, if we drop our CO2 from normal of 40 millimeter of mercury pressure to 20, and every 1 millimeter drop is reducing blood flow to the brain by 2%, 30 seconds of hard breathing is reducing blood flow to the brain by up to 40%. So if you breathe hard for 30 seconds, it's normal that you feel lightheaded. That's not because of hyperoxygenation. That's because of a deficiency of oxygen, because the carotid arteries are constricting and the bond between oxygen and hemoglobin is strengthened. So on one hand, the Wim Hof technique, it is increasing the amount of oxygen dissolved in the blood. On the other hand, it's causing too great a loss of carbon dioxide. This is causing, it's a little bit technical, a left shift of what's called the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve. But basically, the harder you breathe, the more CO2 you get rid of, and the more the red blood cells are holding onto oxygen. So here on one hand, we have increased oxygen dissolved in the blood, but on the other hand, hemoglobin is not releasing oxygen to the tissues, but hemoglobin carries 98% of your oxygen. So really, I think we have to look at, and if you look at Cox's paper on the Wim Hof method, you will see that the SpO2 across the top doesn't increase from hyperventilation. You do see that the carbon dioxide levels dramatically fall, and blood pH does dramatically increase. So the Wim Hof method is a short-term stressor. And I do think it has its benefits because it's increasing epinephrine, it's increasing adrenaline, and it's causing the body to make adaptations to change immune functioning, that the immune system can be targeted through short-term hyperventilation. And this could play a really good role in conditions of autoimmune disease.
Which is the success he's had, right?
Yes.
And they've done studies at the universities in Holland about that.
Correct.
Right.
So there's absolutely benefits to it. I am going to say it's not going to suit everybody. If you hyperventilate for 2-3 minutes, you can have a natural cessation, a natural apnea as a result of it, that your blood oxygen saturations can drop so low, and you have to be careful. And it's not just about, because like I'm playing with the breath all the time. 3 months ago, we had a guy doing the hyperventilation. We had him then, he was hyperventilating, didn't respond. 2-3 minutes, no response. Slapping his face, no response. So we really need to, and I don't...
That's because the blood is dropping in the brain.
There's absolute... Okay, so the hyperventilation, say for the short period of time, has got rid of so much carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is the drive to breathe. So the brain will only send a message to breathe when carbon dioxide climbs back up to that threshold. Gotcha. But if you've got rid of so much CO2 that your CO2 is down here, the brain isn't going to send any signal to breathe. So as a result, you will naturally stop breathing for such a long period of time. And during that time, your blood oxygen saturation will drop because your cells are taking oxygen from the blood, but you've stopped breathing, so you're not replenishing oxygen in the blood. The blood oxygen saturation can drop So the SpO2 can drop down to 40 or 50%. This doesn't happen on Earth. Even if you were at Mount Everest, you wouldn't drop your blood oxygen saturation down that low. So I would be careful.
So it's potentially dangerous. And you've seen Wim come out and say, don't do the water techniques with the breathing techniques.
Absolutely.
So if anyone's listening to that, make sure you don't.
Yes.
Because one of a guy named Josh Waitzkin, who was one of the guys that was on the Tim Ferriss podcast early on, and Josh was in that movie Searching for Bobby Fischer. He was like a chess prodigy.
Yes.
And he was swimming in a New York City athletic club. He's a very accomplished swimmer, but he was doing these breathing techniques, and he basically passed out on the bottom of the pool.
Yes.
And he was there for minutes, and it was amazing that he didn't actually take water in. He kept his mouth closed for some reason. Maybe he was...
He completely stopped breathing.
Yeah.
So because again, if you hyperventilate before getting into a pool, you're getting rid of your alarm to breathe. So you're underwater, you feel absolutely no sensation to breathe because your CO2 levels are being depleted.
Right.
It's not about the CO2 at this point. Your oxygen levels are also dropping. And if you have underwater blackout, there's no warning. You're conscious, you're out. And if you're out underwater, that's a big problem. People have died, so I would say the hyperventilation, doing it on land, very good as a stressor, forcing the body to make adaptations, gives you a good idea of the power of the breath, but not underwater. Now, we do breath holding, but we do breath holding and I think it's really good because it's forcing the body to make adaptations. Now, when we normally do a breath hold, we have the individual, they're walking or they're jogging, and then I'll have them take a breath in through the nose, breath out through the nose, and they pinch their nose. And we also are monitoring their blood oxygen saturation, and we want to drop them down to about 85%, which is severe hypoxia. But the difference between the Wim Hof technique and the oxygen advantage in it, so we always get the question. Wim Hof technique is a hypoxic, hypocapnic approach. Low O2, low CO2. Oxygen advantages, low O2, high CO2. Now, what happens when you do low O2 and high CO2? Well, if you deprive the muscle of oxygen, short term, the hydrogen ion coming from the muscle doesn't get oxidized because there's not sufficient oxygen. If it gets oxidized, it forms water. So instead, in a deficiency of oxygen, that hydrogen ion associate with pyruvic acid, that in turn forms lactic acid. Lactic acid then will dissociate into hydrogen ion and lactate. Carbon dioxide at the same time is increasing during the breath hold, and we can further increase hydrogen ion and bicarbonate. So we have a hydrogen ion from the low oxygen, we have a hydrogen ion from the high CO2, so we're disturbing the blood acid-base balance, we're stimulating anaerobic glycolysis. This then is forcing the body to increase the buffering capacity, probably inside in the muscle compartment. So therefore the hydrogen ions and CO2 that's released from the muscle is released far more slowly. So there's huge adaptations that you can do with simple breath hold techniques if you want to challenge the body, because you can disturb homeostasis, and you can incredibly, if you were to compare this to high intensity interval training, which athletes do to stimulate anaerobic glycolysis, in terms of the blood oxygen level, no comparison.
To continue watching the rest of the episode for free, visit our website londonreal.tv or click the link in the description below.